Hi, I'm Joe. My co-author David works with me on a project called Design Research Works. And this is a fellowship funded by the UK Research and Innovation Funding Council. So it's a kind of fellowship. I'm the leader of the fellowship, but I have a small team of which David is the senior researcher. And the project's going to run for 4 years in total. I'm telling you this because I think the best way of explaining what the paper's about is to give the context of where we're coming from doing this research and kind of explain that title of saying the ultimate measure of success is to disappear completely. So again, the fellowship, the aim of that, the mission is really to show the world the value of design research. Now, most of the people here will understand the value of design research, and including speculative design to some extent. But the point of the fellowship is to expose that to a wider audience. And the reason for this is, I think it's been mentioned in some of the presentations so far, so I think we all probably agree, but the world is at a point in history where it's more complex than it ever has been before. It's moving very quickly and changing very quickly. And one of the things that speculative design and other types of design research is particularly good at is being able to cope with such a dynamic situation. There's, I think, a quote in the paper from James Bridle where he sums this up saying, over the last century, technological acceleration has transformed our planet, our societies, and ourselves, but it has failed to transform our understanding of these things. And I agree with this, and I think that speculative design is one of the tools that can help us transform our understanding of these things. So what we're trying to do with the overall fellowship, the entire 4-year project, is go from a situation where we have design research, including speculative and critical design, but other approaches as well, including co-design, design thinking, and so on. We have these ideas that are out there, but they're currently underutilized. We could get more from them. And I'm trying to stimulate that transition. We're doing it in various ways. We've got grassroots projects where we're actually doing design research projects with partners. We have various community and inclusion projects, but we've also got scholarly and rhetorical work, and the paper fits into that space. It's an essay, it's a position paper, and it's trying to build an argument for why speculative design should be more commonplace to an extent where it actually becomes invisible and we don't need to call it out anymore, in the same way that, I guess, mathematics or statistics or ethics or philosophy, it's kind of accepted that these things have value. And I believe that the ultimate measure of success for speculative design, if it reaches a similar kind of level. So that's the background, and I'm going to just give a kind of overview of the sections in the paper to give you a rough idea of the content that's in there. It is very much an essay, and I think, as a few other authors have said, the best way of fully understanding it is to read it. But here's a very brief introduction. So after the first few paragraphs explaining the overview of the paper, the second section gives a kind of definition of how we see speculative design. And you'll have heard me refer to design research more broadly. And what we say in the paper is that you have this design research banner. Underneath it, you have various techniques, including things like research through design. And we have speculative and critical design and design fiction, which we say is a subsection of research through design. I accept that's not a necessarily agreed upon position, but for the purposes of the argument in the paper, it's a useful move to make. So we open with that kind of assertion. Then we talk about the kinds of knowledge that we might expect to get from using speculative design as a research tool or in any other kind of tool. The key message here is that it's not science. I think, again, we all probably know that, but it's useful to note that what you learn from doing speculative design is fundamentally different from the kind of knowledge that you would get from a more traditional scientific inquiry. It's more contextual. It's about asking questions rather than answers. It's more rhetorical, and it aspires to increase understanding of very messy social and sometimes socio-technical positions. It's also, speculative design it generally resists being turned into a single methodology. there's many ways of doing it, and they must coexist at the same time. And all of these ways, though, tend to derive their value from interpretability. They can sometimes test theory, they can sometimes produce theory. They're almost always a byproduct of some kind of design process, but they can also be a powerful research tool. So it's quite a hard thing to define, but that's what we do in the third section. Then the fourth section follows on directly with a discussion that pulls together various threads, including historically looking at the Enlightenment, looking at the separation of art and science that happened around the start of the Industrial Revolution, and then the early part of the 20th century, talking about the rise of logical positivism. And all of these things, we bring them together to try and make the point that scientism, which is the idea that science is the only legitimate way to understand the world, we make the point that scientism is still the dominant knowledge paradigm in the world that we live in. And it's probably more pervasive and far-reaching than I think most of us really realize. And an example of that I would suggest is that social science calls itself a science. And I think that's a hang-up from this dominance of scientism. That's just one example, but there's many examples we could go to. But we argue that scientism is incredibly pervasive. Now, the kind of knowledge that scientism gives credit to is incredibly different from the kind of knowledge and understanding and insight you get from speculative design. So the reason how the argument's stacking up so far in the paper is that we need to be aware that the world is preconditioned to not necessarily want to be receiving the kind of insights we might get through speculative design. In the fifth section, we talk about two lenses. They're specifically consilience, which is the idea that you might be able to unify all different kinds of inquiry, from anthropological through to philosophical through to the physical sciences. That's the lens of consilience, and also a pragmatist lens. And we use both of these to try and imagine ways that speculative design could break into the mainstream to become more of the norm, not an outlier, but something which is universally accepted. I don't think either of those lenses are necessarily the answer, but it's a useful narrative device in the structure of the paper to go through that. And then finally, section 6 discusses how, rather than this wholesale change in the short term, maybe we could look at some more incremental changes, some specific things we could do that actually relate to teaching speculative design. And by doing those things, we think, and it stacks up with the kind of rhetoric of the paper, we think that that would put us on a trajectory where in a number of years' time, whether it's 5, 10, or 25 years' time, that title of the paper is recognized, where speculative design would disappear and just become part of the norm. So here's 3 of the kind of bits of advice or suggestions that we get to at the end. The first would be to explicitly acknowledge that speculative design, and indeed the other kind of design research topics more generally, they're inherently ambiguous. There's so many variations, and I guess because all design practice is ultimately particular, each time you do it, it's going to be unique. I think that makes defining all of this stuff almost impossible. It's inherently ambiguous. And I think acknowledging that when we're teaching students, although it might be difficult to get across, would be useful and actually empower them in the long run. So I said right at the start that we kind of introduced this model where we said we have design research, and there's a subsection of that is research through design, a subsection of that is speculative design. I accept that's not correct, but I think it's a useful way of presenting it to students, for example. I'm sure people in the room would have their own ways of doing it. It's fine to use any way, but I think teaching that there's more than one way and acknowledging the differences between them and allowing students to make their own judgment will empower them. The next thing is that we should teach speculative design research through design and design research, not just in our design departments and architecture departments. We should teach it more generally. And I'm actively trying to produce some content, which would be something along the lines of a practical speculative design 101 for non-designers. And this doesn't necessarily mean that students and others, professionals accessing this kind of thing, would be immediately experts, but I think it would be useful to proactively go out there and tell people in other disciplines about the kind of speculative design work that we do. And I think the final one I kind of leave it with is that although the paper argues that to disappear completely would be the ultimate measure of success, the short-term goal is really about visibility. And within that aim, I think we shouldn't be shy about explaining that difference between speculative design and science. And don't be shy as well of acknowledging that dominance of scientism, because I think if we look anywhere below the surface, we'll see that that narrative is tacitly within almost all of us more than we expect. And part of the reason I'm embarking on this entire project is to try and redress that balance, to kind of dial down the societal scientism knob and dial up the speculative design and arts and humanities knob a little bit. And I think we'd benefit from that. So there you have it. That's what the paper's about and the context that it comes from. And perhaps in the same way that the Enlightenment thinking, I think, sort of led us to this scientism being the dominant paradigm, perhaps a 21st century Enlightenment is a process that's, when it's complete, we'll see speculative design come into the mainstream more. And I think that would be a good thing. So there we go. Thank you very much.
I wanted to ask you regarding, because you mentioned that about this trend towards scientism, and I think that yes, I mean that's like quite strong. But I wanted to ask you, how do you see? Because I've noticed that at least in the UK, in the Open Policy Lab, they are like using a speculative, or there has been like some experiences using a speculative design as way of like foster public engagement. And I think that I've seen that also like in other research contexts, maybe not that much, but there is interest. So how do you see the future of that? Do you think that the speculative design could find a way, like in more like this public engagement think tanks, or like especially when thinking from the government perspective? Or how do you think that there is a door there, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I really do. And I think there's Policy Lab is a good example, and there's various other examples, including the Scottish government and increasingly private sector consultancy businesses. The likes of the large multinational consultancy businesses are using these techniques. I think the problem, however, is a slight lack of expertise and human resource that can deliver the need. One of perhaps if you look at design thinking, one of the reasons that was so successful is, as I think Tom pointed out, you can kind of distill it to a step-by-step process. It isn't that difficult to follow, and if you follow that, you have successfully done design thinking. That doesn't, though, make you a particularly good designer or speculative designer. And I think good speculative design is a step above that kind of level of tool set, but there aren't that many people who have the experience of doing it. And the way you get good at these kind of things is through practice. So I think another reason why the special issue of the journal was so timely. So I think there will be a way, but we need more people, and they need to be taught really well.
Well, I guess firstly, I would just say I think that was an excellent wrap up to this session. The kind of the statement. It was very good how it summed up the whole, a lot of the thinking. But I suppose one of the things that a lot of people have expressed is how it can be challenging to defend speculative and critical design to university authorities as a legitimate subject to be taught and to have accreditation and on all of the administrative bureaucracy that the universities need for legitimacy. I think this is probably far too big a question for you to answer here, but I just thought I wondered if you had a quick response to that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think so. I'll answer with a sort of anecdote. When I was just starting my PhD, it was called itself a post-disciplinary PhD. They were trying to transcend the kind of disciplinary silos. Now, what it turned out was we had tutors from 3 disciplines, and most of the students ended up being strongly identifying with one or other of them. But I, in that time, was kind of getting into speculative design and imagining alternatives. And I imagined a future where you have a university system like what we have now, and then you have another one where all of the disciplines are collapsed completely. And they would coexist happily. And I think, for want of a better term, the one at the collapsed non-disciplinary university, they would probably exhibit a lot of the traits of good design researchers and good speculative designers. And the ones at the other university might have more in-depth specializations. So that was an extreme way that my mind led me to deal with the problem you're talking about, I think. I would say, from my experience, maybe that problem is getting less, that the larger the body of examples of successful projects involving speculative design, that will be more and more accepted. I think an interesting quirk of it that you may be familiar with in the UK is that I think the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council probably funds a lot more speculative design than the Arts and Humanities Council. And I think it's because they've recognized it brings value to these socio-technical problems that they're concerned with. But those are just some thoughts. Don't have a more coherent kind of response, but I agree, it's an interesting thing to watch.